Welcome, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces in the attendee list tonight. As always, let us know where you're joining us from. We'll wait for everybody to get in, and then we'll get started in just a minute. As always, we have a bunch of good events coming up, especially if you are local and can get to the museum. We have an incredible series of Trouble Begins coming up, I think, April, May, and June. So that's worthwhile. It's worthwhile to come to all of them. They're going to build to our incredible event with Percival Everett in early June, talking about his new novel, Jane. So, all right. Oh, we've got people from all over. Excellent. Great to see everyone tonight. You may be used to seeing Omar here. He wasn't able to be with us tonight. My name's Erin Bartram. I'm the Associate Director for Education here at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program for Arming the World, American Gun Makers in the Gilded Age. Virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We're grateful to honor his memory with these programs. Thank you to our members. I think there are a few of you here tonight. If you're not a member, consider supporting our museum by becoming one, even if you are a person who primarily attends virtual events. There are a lot of benefits to being a member, even for those of you who may live out of the state. You receive free or discounted admission to author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. Please visit our website and hit donate for more information. Now on to our guests. Jeffrey Stewart received AB and AM degrees from Brown University and legal training at Harvard Law. He is co-author of The Anointed, a history of the rise to prominence of three influential New York City law firms during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mr. Stewart has written articles for law reviews and legal publications, as well as two privately published books. He is currently at work on a book about the United States Confederation period, 1781 to 89, and he lives in Bethesda, Maryland. Our moderator, Dean King, is an award-winning author of 10 nonfiction books, including Guardians of the Valley, Skeletons on the Sahara, Unbound, and The Feud in Appalachia. His writing has appeared in Granta, National Geographic Adventure, Travel and Leisure, New York Magazine, New York Times, and other publications. He's also appeared on NPR's Talk of the Nation, ABC World News Tonight, PBS American Experience, BBC Radio, and TEDx. He is a partner of Gum Street Productions, which is currently developing a feature documentary for Netflix. So, as always, during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. But if you have a specific question, please put that directly in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. That just helps us keep track of questions. Otherwise, I'm sort of scrambling to write things down from the chat as we go. So use the Q&A. And don't worry, we'll have plenty of time for that towards the end if you're still working on formulating the question you want to ask. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff and Dean.
Okay. I'd just like to say that Jeff, this is a wonderful book, and it's the concise storytelling here really moves and really sweeps you through an important period of history in a very entertaining way. So while it's, to the audience, while it's about the arms industry and arms trafficking and bureaucratic malfeasance and all kinds of interesting, serious topics, you'll also get the need for a lighter Gatling gun to be mounted on camels in Egypt, and air ballooning into Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, and a young czar's son going buffalo hunting with the chief of the Lakota Sioux, and George Armstrong Custer and Wild Bill Cody. So it's really pleasurable history. So I congratulate you on that, Jeff. And I thought maybe you could just start off by telling us why you entitled this "Arming the World," and how you came to be interested in the subject.
Sure, Dean. Thank you very much for moderating, and enjoy being here. I'm not sure I've done a webcast before, so You'll have to bear with me as I struggle with Zoom, but we'll do the best we can. Yeah, the book's title comes from the fact that there was an interlude in American history in the dozen years, 15 years after the Civil War, when American gun companies, some of which are household names, many of which no one today has heard of, basically armed every major power on earth, either with guns or with gun-making machinery or with licensed gun technology. Customers were Russia, France, Egypt, Spain, Turkey, even Pope Pius's Vatican Guard armed themselves with American weapons. And a lot of companies that we know of today that we don't think of as gun companies, like Pratt and Whitney, got their start selling gun machinery overseas.
Well, you start this story at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, and you captured me right off the bat with that because it starts out not going well for the Americans, and by the end of it, the tide has turned. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Crystal Palace exhibition, it was 1851, was really the world's first World's Fair. And it was put on by the Victorian elite in England to prove to the world how rich and how powerful Great Britain was. They invited all countries to come, and all countries did come, often sending their crown jewels or other fantastic, beautiful things. The U.S. was invited, but the U.S. at the time was viewed as sort of a cultural backwater and a fairly crude and uninteresting place. Unbeknownst to the organizers of the exhibition and everybody else, our country had made enormous strides in the early middle decades of the 19th century in manufacturing. Most of it actually coming out of the gun business because of the War Department's adoption of the idea of interchangeable parts, which is told in the book. At the Crystal Palace, the American exhibition at first was pathetically crude, but it improved. And then people were amazed that things like the McCormick Reaper made its international debut at Crystal Palace. The Yacht America, the America's Cup fame, showed up and won by far the regatta at the Isle of Wight that was held in connection with this. So people started going to the American exhibition, and there was Samuel Colt showing his revolver and firing. You could get one of his revolvers and sit there and fire it, and there were long lines of people who did. And then in a display case in the corner were 6 rifles from an obscure company in Vermont. And if you read it, you realize these rifles were not only for sale, they had interchangeable parts. And that was a signal to the Europeans. The US had had an amazing breakthrough in manufacturing that no one else in the world was even close to.
Jeff, I know you have some photographs. If at any point during this conversation you want to pop them on the screen, feel free.
Yeah, let me put one up now. This is going to let's see how well I do. This is one that I don't know if you can see it. I think I have to find the share screen button, but I think I can find it here. Here it is. Can you see this? Does
Yes.
this image come up on everyone's screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Yeah, for those of you in Hartford who have traveled through Hartford, that's the dome of the Colt Armory. And that building was built in about 1853, and it's the cover of the illustration of the cover of the book. And Samuel Colt built that to announce his success in selling weapons to the Tsar of Russia. But the building itself was somewhat amazing and was an astonishing breakthrough because it was packed with hundreds and hundreds of machine tools. And really, it was here that the modern production line was first invented. And Colt and his cousin's husband, named Root, were the ones that built that. And that caused the British to send a delegation to America to see what was happening. And of course, they were bowled over by what they saw there at the Colt Armory.
And Colt was a larger than life. Sorry.
Yeah, he was an amazing self-promoter and did a wonderful job. Oop, now what did I just do? Did a wonderful job promoting his wares, and actually even got invited to the Tsar's coronation. I think it was 1850 something. Hang on, I gotta get this back to full screen again though. Okay, there we are. Yeah, so that was the Colt Armory. Oh, here we are, we're all back again. And on top of it is a golden statue, a gilded statue of a Colt holding a broken lance in its mouth, sort of to announce that whose armory it really was. So,
Of course, so the Civil War is going to escalate the making of arms in the United States. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the federal armories, the difference in the two that were established, and then the private arms makers, and talk a little bit about that dynamic.
sure. It goes back, as so many things do, literally to George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. After the Revolutionary War, Washington insisted that the U.S. had to become self-sufficient in weaponry. His army, the Continental Army, actually had been armed by France, which sent over shipload after shipload of high-quality French muskets, which is really what got the Americans through the war. When it was over, he said, we have to be self-sufficient, and the U.S. government should found its own arms factory. Alexander Hamilton did a study of it, which agreed with Washington's analysis. And in 1794, the U.S. Congress appropriated the money necessary to build armories, and Washington chose two, one in the north, one in the south. North was Springfield, Massachusetts. South was Harper's Ferry and what was then Virginia. They got off to a slow start, but they grew and grew and grew. There were huge cultural differences between the armories, reflecting how different these different parts of the country were. In the South, at Harper's Ferry, they progressed slowly, sticking to artisanal traditions. But in the North, where skilled labor was short, Springfield began adopting modern machine tool technology, encouraged invention, and became a customer for anyone who could sell them high-quality machine tools. And then when they began adopting interchangeable parts, which happened in 1815, Springfield really made it happen. When the federal government let out arms contracts, it also required contractors to use the same technology. So the machines and methods pioneered at Springfield radiated outward from Springfield into the private firms, which then had to adopt the same methods and same machinery as the federal armories did. That ended up implementing common standards across the whole industry. The Connecticut River Valley became sort of the Silicon Valley of its day. And from Springfield down to Windsor, Vermont, then down to Hartford, all the way down to the Connecticut coast, the arms industry flourished as a result of these many breakthroughs.
So there's a standardization, but yet there's also incredible innovation and a lot of, again, larger than life characters, engineers coming up with new techniques, and then a lot of bureaucratic back and forth, because it's one thing to invent some new technology and make an improvement, but it's another thing to implement that into the Army, mass produce it and get it out and have it function in the field. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there were a lot of larger than life characters. Some were in the ordnance department, some were private manufacturers, and some names we know besides Colt. We've heard of Winchester and others like that. But the administration of it really required the ability to make very precise things in very large volumes. And this meant you had to have real regimes of quality control and a very stiff hierarchy on the government side to make it all work in the armories, and then similarly on the private side. But what it led to as well were this profusion of Yankee geniuses who seemed to come out of nowhere and continually invent new things. My favorite is a guy named Thomas Blanchard, who grew up near Worcester, Mass., who is almost certainly on the autism spectrum and invented one amazing machine after another. He's best known for one that produced gun stocks. The stocks of guns were cut from black walnut, and it took a skilled artisan about a day to make a gun stock. Blanchard's machine cut that down to 2 minutes, to the absolute astonishment of everybody who saw it. And then others also came along and invented machines for rifling guns, for reaming out guns, for duplicating small parts, and so on. And this is what really allowed the gun business to grow, advance its capacity, and cut costs. Because until this was done, anything with interchangeable parts was prohibitively expensive, which is why nobody but Americans ever really tried to do it. So that's really, and a lot of the great names you might not know unless you became a student of machine tools, and I doubt that many people want to become students of machine tools, although it is a very fascinating subject.
Did that lead to a great advance in advantage in the United States in manufacturing of all kinds? And how long would that last if that's the case?
Yeah, because it lent itself, anything made with small metal parts that had to be very precise could be made by the machines that made these guns. In later years, all kinds of things came out, from washing machines to locks to other things like that. But the technology required not just a lot of machines, but new management methods, which were pioneered at the armories and really implemented by the U.S. Army, in fact. In later years, a lot of the explosion of American productivity after the Civil War can be traced to the breakthroughs that happened at the armories before, during the Civil War.
And we're going to advance from muzzle loading guns to breech loaders. Rifling is going to change the accuracy. And I wrote a book about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, and people often ask me, how'd those guys shoot at each other so often and not kill each other more, kill more people? And I never had a great answer for that until I read your book, and you give great statistics on how difficult it was to hit somebody with these weapons. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's one of the great myths that, people are great marksmen and shoot really well and all that. And there are many who are, but in truth, almost nobody ever hit anybody with these guns. The smooth bore guns, originally guns didn't have rifling. Everyone knew rifling was good. There were rifled crossbows, in fact, but they were very hard to load a rifle. And so in the military tactics of the day, you wanted to be able to shoot frequently and fast. So you had these smoothbore guns, and the musket ball, because they fired balls, would ricochet down the barrel and come out spinning more or less randomly and arcing here and there like a curveball at a baseball game. And so maybe 1 out of 1,000 bullets ever hit anybody. Maybe that's an overstatement. It certainly was no better than 1 out of a few hundred. And they used the old black powder, which produced all that gun smoke you hear about. And so nobody could see anyway. So it'd be pretty hard to aim. So they just blasted away traditionally. And then after a few rounds, they put on mounted the bayonets and charged the other side. And that's how things were fought. Everyone knew that rifles would do better, but they were hard to load because the bullet had to fit into the gun barrel or it wouldn't spin as a rifle bullet is supposed to. Borrowing an idea actually from natives in South India, finally a projectile was invented that would go in easily, then expand, and then be a rifled projectile. We know that as the mini ball, although in this country we used a different one called the Burton ball. That came into existence in the 1850s, and people began adopting that gun. And that was what was used mainly in our Civil War. However, experience showed soldiers were so terrified in battle, they still didn't aim. And in the Civil War, maybe 1 out of 200 shots hit anybody, and maybe it wasn't even that much. At the end of the Civil War, a new technology came along, breech loaders, where you put the bullet in the back. That's the kind of gun everyone knows about today. That didn't improve accuracy, but it did reduce the number of mistakes, and it increased firepower. The breakthrough there really wasn't the gun, it was the metallic cartridge, which is what sealed the gun so hot gases didn't fly in the face of the soldier. By the end of the Civil War, it was clear breech loaders were the future, and that the muzzle loaders, of which there were many millions, were obsolete.
I was interested in a section where you talked about the Union Army trying to create a sharpshooter unit, and it really had spotted success because of some of the conditions of war. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the word sharpshooter doesn't come from the fact that they often use Sharps rifles. It's a German term from the Napoleonic Wars, actually. But there were a lot of people saying, well, we can win this war if we just have really good marksmen sneaking around, picking off officers and things like that. And both sides had them. The difficulty was that it was hard to get the right guns and ammunition, but more to the point, it was very, very dangerous to be that close to the front lines. And although the sharpshooter units were very effective, they also suffered crazy casualties, and ultimately they were abandoned. But their use of breech loading guns, because they needed breech loading guns because they had to hide behind trees and bushes, and that would be hard to do if you had to stand up and load your gun from the top. It proved the idea. And by the end of the war, although I don't think accuracy got much better, no soldier would pass up the chance to beg, borrow, or steal a breech loader if he could get one.
Mm. And
so that's our story, the breech loader. Yeah.
You talk about also, in addition to advances in the guns, the advances in the munitions were equally as important, and I guess one depended upon the other. But maybe just a little bit about what happened with the munitions during this period.
Yeah. As mentioned, the difficulty with the breech loader is the superheated gases spewing out of the back of the gun right in the face of the person shooting, and that obviously wouldn't work. So early on, it was clear that the thing to do was to put the gunpowder and everything else into a metallic tube, or open one end, but a tube, and put it in the back, and the tube would keep the gases from escaping. The problem was making that shell accurately. And ironically, the Connecticut had developed over the years a very successful industry making brass buttons up around Waterbury and in the Naugatuck Valley, which required enormous knowledge of copper and brass alloys and how to stamp them. And machinery had been developed up there for extruding brass and copper. And these were adapted to actually form the cartridge shells. And during the Civil War, they finally got to the point where they could mass produce them. And it was that really that opened the way for the breech loading gun.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on from the Civil War, where would you rank this period in terms of the transformation of weaponry, I guess in modern human times? Is this the quickest changing period, or is there anything that compares to it?
No, it's not until the advent of automatic weapons after World War II. There were really two back-to-back revolutions that happened 10 years apart. The first was the mini ball, which we talked about, which for the first time made it practicable to arm armies with rifled guns, which had much greater range and could be much more deadly. The U.S. never quite understood how to use the mini ball, but other countries did. The breech loader then was the next one. The breech loader did revolutionize everything, mainly because it increased the rate of fire from about 2 shots a minute to maybe 15.
Mhm.
It all allowed soldiers to stay in trenches or behind bushes to reload, so they didn't have to stand up and expose themselves. And it allowed mass volley fire at a rate no one had seen before. Now, it used a ridiculous amount of ammunition, but clever Yankees came up with ways of producing amazing amounts of ammunition. In fact, let me show you a picture of what an ammunition plant looked like. Let me see if where it is here. Well, here it is, right here. I've got to share the screen, which is going to take me a moment to do. Here it is. I don't know if you can see this or not. Is it centered? Is there any, can you see it right now? Here we go.
It's not up yet. Here we go. I think it's coming now.
Yeah, that's what an ammunition plant looked like in the 1870s. You'll notice it's all mostly women. They use women and boys to do it because the manual dexterity required to load the cartridges. This was dangerous work. It was you might have industrial accidents at an armory, but you had explosions in ammunition plants. And if you looked at the workers who died in this business in those years, disproportionately high number were women. We're going to come back to this in a minute because you'll notice how well dressed all these ladies are, and there's a reason for it. But if you look, you can see what the factory was like. The shafting at the top, I don't know if my cursor will show it.
Mhm.
That is where the power came. Those big cones are full of gunpowder, which is dropped into the shells. And then the ladies are taking these and putting them in these little, I don't know what you call them, forms where they go on to the next level. This plant was capable of producing 400,000 cartridges a day, and it was not the biggest of the ammunition plants. And this, by the way, is United Metallic Cartridge, which was in Bridgeport.
You know,
Let me get this off.
I was very interested by your discussion of the innovations from the private side of arms manufacturing, and how the creative engineers would invent things and patent them, and then they could sell them. The government seemed pretty open; they could patent and take advantage of those kinds of things. It's really an interesting relationship between government, I guess, and private industry at the time. And maybe
Yeah.
just a word on that.
Yeah, the government didn't protect any of its intellectual property back then. And anyone could walk into any government armory or ammunition plant, see whatever they wanted, copy it, and even patent it. And actually, a lot of the things that made individual inventors or companies wealthy really had been invented by the Army, and they were just copied. The reason for it had to do with the political philosophy of the time, that this was the government. After all, the government responded to the people. So if the people wanted access to technology, there it was. You could think about it as being very unfair to the government. But on the other hand, it was an amazing fertilizer for private initiative. And given the role the government had in research and development, the low barriers to copying it actually were a windfall to the rest of the country, as everything from machine tools to accounting methods were copied from the government and found their way throughout the whole economy.
And then at the close of the war, our industry is so ramped up that they need an outlet for this capacity. And so they show great American salesmanship and quickly go to Europe. They move there and live there, and certainly in the 1870, 71 in France, there's a big demand. And maybe tell us about that transition to Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, the war was over. The Union was awash in guns even before the war was over. At the end of the war, the head of the Confederate Ordnance Department calculated that the Union could make 5,000 guns a day. The Confederacy could not make even 100. There were so many guns. They were using literally old muskets to pave roads in certain areas. So the government canceled all the arms contracts. All these private firms that had been subsidized to get into the business now were in trouble. And then the government dumps all of its surplus guns to anyone who will buy one. You could buy a Springfield musket for $2 at the end of the Civil War. A lot of people were just driven out of business. Those who stayed, though, saw the opportunity, and it was this that I think makes the subject so interesting. You had a new technology that everybody had to have. War was threatened in Europe. In fact, there were three big wars between 1866 and 1877. The balance of power had been upset by a lot of different things, and everybody had to rearm, but nobody had the right guns, nobody had the ammunition, nobody had the industrial capacity of the Americans. And so basically, the US makers flooded the market. They sent people everywhere in the world to sell their guns. And it took a while for it to really take hold. But by 1870, there wasn't a European country, except perhaps Germany, that wasn't using American guns or American technology. And even Germany had all three of its major armories were purchased from Pratt & Whitney in Hartford. In 1870, the long expected war between Prussia and France broke out. And most people thought France would win. Prussia actually crushed the French pretty quickly. The government was overthrown. There was a rebellion. A new government was formed in the countryside and new armies were raised. They didn't have any guns. So through J.P. Morgan's father in London and Samuel Remington, who lived in London, the French government agreed to buy as many weapons as the U.S. could send them. So Samuel Remington told every gun maker, I'll take whatever you can make. And then he pried open the doors of the federal armories to get whatever they would sell them. And in the space of about 6 months, I think it was 23 shiploads of American weapons went over to France. And it was everything from obsolete muskets to modern Gatling guns to artillery batteries. And the French even bought one of the Civil War ironclads and had it towed over to France in the midst of all this. And so when people say, gee, what happened to all those guns from the Civil War? Well, they ended up in gigantic mountains of surplus weapons over in France. Meanwhile, of course, everybody else was buying guns too.
What was the larger impact on international politics of this new capacity to manufacture arms? And I mean,
Yes.
is it the beginning of the modern arms race?
Well, it was. I mean, it was an armed camp. It wasn't just the fact that there was a new weapon coming along at a time when war was looming. It was that the basic structure of European security had fallen apart. And what caused it to fall apart were all kinds of unexpected things. One was the Suez Canal, which jeopardized Britain's position as a maritime power. The other was that Russia was expanding and threatening England both in the Great Game in Central Asia and wished to in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire was the main way to stop Russia from expanding, but it was collapsing, and its most important province, Egypt, was trying to secede because the Egyptians had gotten wildly wealthy during the American Civil War by selling cotton. And they then hired dozens of Union and Confederate officers to rebuild their army and bought maybe 175,000 rifles from Remington to start a war against their overlords in Istanbul. So everybody was uneasy and anxious about what was happening. And then they were rearming as best they could against what they knew was going to be a very major war between Russia and Turkey that was going to really decide a lot more things than what was between Russia and Turkey. A specific battle would be over access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea through the straits known as the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, which Russia envied. And that was what this war was going to be about. And of course, the war did break out in 1877.
And there was the Battle of Plevna. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I will. In fact, I'll share if I can find it. Here it is. this sort of says it all about the Battle of Plevna, and we'll talk about Plevna a little bit. Of course, I'm sorry, I moved things around on my, here's my screen, right here. Oop, there it is. Is it apparent now?
Yes.
Can I see this? Good. This is a painting from 1885 by a Russian artist of one part of the Battle of Plevna. Plevna lasted almost 5 months. And what happened is the Russians invaded thinking they would fairly quickly overrun Turkey, and they just about did, until one Turkish force in this town of Plevna in Bulgaria held them off for a long time. And during that period of time, the other powers were able to get together and form a diplomatic alliance to try to keep the Turkish Empire together. What I like about this painting is this kind of tells the whole story. The soldiers on the parapet here are Turks. You can see their red fezzes. They're firing the Peabody Martini rifles that Turkey bought from the Providence Tool Company. Turkey bought 605,000 of these rifles. The men with the flag over here, I don't know if my cursor is visible or not, those are Romanians. And Plevna is viewed, or the victory over the Turks is viewed really as the beginning of Romanian independence. The Romanians have just attacked and overrun this redoubt. They're armed with Peabody rifles, which were also made by the Providence Tool Company. These guns are Krupp cannon. The closure was invented by an American named Broadwell. Over here on the left, you see the soldiers in the white jackets. I don't know if you can see those or not. I hope I have this centered. Those are Russians. They're holding Berdan rifles made in Hartford by Colt or made in England or Russia by license. The Russians also bought 135,000 Smith & Wesson heavy revolvers, which they were carrying. The Turks also had Winchester rifles with them. The ammunition on both sides, all the bullets flying back and forth in this picture came from Connecticut. The Russians and the Romanians came from United Metallic Cartridge. That was the factory we saw with the ladies working at the machinery. The Turks had half of theirs from that factory and the other half from Winchester. So here we are in Bulgaria, and this battle was September 11, 1877. And you see these two armies, together about 250,000 soldiers battling, and almost everyone is carrying an American gun and everyone is shooting American ammunition. The Russian ammunition, by the way, went from Bridgeport to St. Petersburg, and then by train down to Crimea, and then slowly through Romania and Bulgaria, and then by horseback to Plevna, so it could shoot these people who were shooting back essentially the same cartridges. So that's the Battle of Plevna, and that's why it's so intriguing, is kind of the apotheosis of this American weapons sales. And it's, I didn't mention both sides had any number of Gatling guns. And this has always struck me as kind of underscoring the whole story here. Anyhow, the Turks ended up being conquered by the Russians, but before Russia could seize Constantinople and take control of the Straits, the British fleet pulled up, and the Congress of Berlin, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck stripped Russia of its victory, and Russia never got control of the Straits. And to bring it to the present, we read about the war in Ukraine now, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet having such trouble with these Ukrainian drones. And you say, well, why don't they just sail away after all? Their ships just get out of there. Well, the answer is they can't. During times of war, warships cannot go through the Straits. The Russian fleet is not allowed to leave the Black Sea, and that is largely because of Plevna.
Was there, going back to the beginning of American becoming preeminent in the production of arms and munitions, it was, I guess, England and Birmingham where you had the craftsmen who were controlled, I guess, were considered the best builder of arms. Was there eventually then pushback in this period? Is this going to end in bankruptcy for some of these manufacturers in the United States? What was the reaction around the world to America's preeminence in arms manufacturing at the time?
Well, they didn't like it. Nobody wanted to be dependent on, a foreign country for their weaponry, and particularly any major power. The famous British Infield Armory was actually bought in the U.S. And not only were all the machines from Springfield, Mass, and Windsor, Vermont, actually all the factory supervisors were Americans that were brought over as well. There was enormous pushback all over Europe to all of this because they had an ancient tradition of gunsmiths, very highly trained, very skilled individuals who handmade everything. Yet all of a sudden, these machines could do it, and you didn't need any special talent at all to make a gun anymore. So there was enormous resentment, but sooner or later they had to adapt, because if they didn't, they were simply going to be overwhelmed. And so country by country, they finally acceded to this way of doing things, although it took them a very long time to do it. As late as the 1870s, the French were still having problems mass producing guns. And the British and others had a lot of trouble mass producing ammunition well into the 1880s. So there was a lot of resistance, but it was progress, which is going to, go forward like it or not. And that happened here.
Does America still have an advantage in building? Well, I don't know if it's just guns or all weaponry. I think the big weaponry it maybe is more obvious, but in guns, are we still the best creators of guns?
I'm not strangely enough, I don't know a lot about guns. I've studied the arms industry. There's mostly it's a difference of opinion of what makes a good gun. There's some who say, well, you've got to have something that's really simple, anyone can use, easy to repair, doesn't cost much. That's like the Russian AK-47. Others that say no, technological edge means a lot. Therefore, you want a more advanced gun like the Americans have always used. And there are a lot of people in the middle. One of the ironies is that ever since probably World War One, maybe before that, small arms like rifles and so on really are not all that decisive anymore. Most casualties happened in World War One and Two, or World War One by artillery and later by air power. Yet, small arms are still what you see a lot of. But for in large part, if you're looking at where damage really occurs, it's heavier weapons of one sort or the other.
Well, Jeff, you've told a wonderful story about this period of history, both in the weaponry and the anecdotes that you've chosen, because I know there was so much material, and you really did a great job for the reader. I encourage everybody to get the book and read it. Are there any of the anecdotes, like one of your favorite anecdotes that maybe I mentioned some of the humor, anything you'd like to mention before we go to questions?
My favorite one is the one I think we mentioned, which was the very strange visit in, this was what, 1871 and 2, of the Tsar's son to the United States. It came, Russia and the US were very close friends in those years. And after the Civil War, the fleets went back in squadrons, naval squadrons, to visit and show the flag. And I think it's 1871, the Tsar sent his son at the head of the squadron to the U.S. to do so, and ostensibly to look at the weapons plants, which he did. But in fact, he visited the United Metallic Cartridge plant. Let me get that back up because it's a funny story. The ladies were quite excited about having a Russian prince visit them. It was the first real member of European royalty to come to the United States. So they wore their best dresses and put ribbons on the machinery to kind of look nice and celebrate. And Alexei Alexandrovich, who was the Tsar's son, when he left, they said, "What do you think of this?" He goes, "Well, I'll tell you only that American workers certainly dress very well." But then word got out through the painter was not Alexander Bierstadt. I'll have to remember his name. that Alexei liked to hunt and would like to hunt buffalo. And that word went to the War Department, and William Tecumseh Sherman said, well, we better put together an expedition. So he assigned Philip Sheridan the job. Sheridan hired Buffalo Bill Cody and ordered George Armstrong Custer to put this together, and they did. They engaged the Brule Band of the Sioux and its chief Spotted Tail to join everyone, since they figured you had to have Indians if you're having a buffalo hunt. And I think it's January, in the middle of Nebraska, Alexei and this went buffalo hunting, and there were all kinds of strange stories coming out of it. I've got to get rid of this. But perhaps the most interesting, sorry, I've got to close some windows here. I apologize for my ineptitude. Where'd it go? Here it is. But one of the truly weird stories that came out of it all was that Alexei and George Armstrong Custer became reasonably good friends. And here's a photo of the Tsar's son. He's, get this move over. He's on the right. And there's George Armstrong Custer. You see on the Tsarevich's hip is the ivory-handled revolver Smith & Wesson had just given him when he visited there. Custer's holding a Sharps rifle, which is probably the one he had with him when he was killed at Little Bighorn. That was his weapon. I don't know what else he's holding there. The picture's been cropped. On the other side, actually, was Buffalo Bill Cody. Anyhow, it was one of those funny stories of these coincidences that happened, and years later when Custer died with everyone else at Little Bighorn, a number of the Sioux braves he'd hunted with were among the people who massacred his command.
Oh. Your
One of
description of that in the book is wonderful and very entertaining. Well, thank you for this great look at your book. And Aaron, maybe it's time to throw the floor up into questions from the audience.
Yeah, we've got a couple here, and one, there's a bit here, and I'm going to kind of wrap it into a question that I think will dovetail well. So Walter has mentioned the idea of kind of a massive field of casualties in the period of a relatively inaccurate fire, compared to what you're talking about later. And I guess something I was wondering about, and I thought it was interesting that you made the point that much later, in even these later wars, small arms are not doing most of the damage. But I wonder, with this shift to more accurate weaponry, stuff that's easier to load, all this kind of stuff, do we have any expressions from people at the time about how it changed the way they thought about the weapons they used, to know that they had a better chance of killing someone than they might have had before? Do we have, I know that it's hard to get the feelings of soldiers on the ground, but I'm wondering how all these innovations affected the way people thought about using these weapons.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. The average soldier was so terrorized, I'm not sure that he really, gave that much thought to it. When they picked up the discarded muskets at Gettysburg, they found maybe a quarter of them had been misloaded. The soldiers were so frightened they couldn't even load their guns right. And the black powder they used produced so much white smoke that you really almost couldn't see your opponent. But one thing they did do was fire incessantly. They were told just keep firing, and that was at Plevna too, just fire and fire and fire. And so bullets were flying around everywhere, and a lot of the soldiers who were killed were not killed by somebody who aimed at them. They were killed by the fact that no matter where you were, bullets were going everywhere. In terms of their view about killing, I don't know it was any different then than before. I think the enemy was pretty anonymous. One thing that stopped happening, though, this is not so much about guns, bayonet charges went away. In the old days, you'd take your bayonet and hope to stab somebody, but the rate of fire had increased to the point you'd never get that close. You would be dead before you ever got to the enemy line. So these frontal assaults changed in a lot of ways, and not so much from people wanting that they were upset at killing the opponent, more because soldiers knew they weren't going to survive it.
Yeah, That is, I mean, it's interesting to think about all of these incredible innovations and the specificity and all of this scientific work that goes into it, and then just this to get to a thing where it is complete chaos and fright and
Yeah.
has the desired effect. Stephanie here is asking whether the women in this industry were better or worse compensated than other manufacturing jobs.
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure they paid as little as they could get away with. It was a reasonably skilled job, though, and of course, it was dangerous. I mean, Winchester during the Civil War had more than one ammunition plant blow up, killing everybody or most people in it. And so I think that workers probably demanded more money for that job. And it's not that there was a shortage of factory jobs in New England in those days. But it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. You know, that's something I'll see if I can learn about because I think it's a good thing to think through.
Yeah, and someone else here asked similarly about production and management policy and the explosion, specifically at the Hazard Powder Company and the Allegheny Arsenal.
Yeah.
If you can talk more about the danger of this work.
Well, I mean, it was black powder. You know, we talk about gunpowder. Gunpowder today has nothing in common with the gunpowder back then. I mean, we use the same word, but it's as similar as wax and gasoline. They're just not the same thing. The old black powder was sort of dangerous. It was mostly saltpeter, which is very unstable. And then the primer was fulminate, which quite literally will blow up if you drop it. And part of the operation was putting the fulminate into the shell, which is really asking for trouble. So it was dangerous. In fact, they knew it was dangerous, and reflecting that was that these factories all had very thick walls and very thin roofs. That's because when they blew up, the roof would go, but not the walls, and they knew that. It was very hard work. The hazard powder explosion is well known, although I don't particularly know that much about it. But of course, there was no safety regulation of any sort back then. And if somebody died in an explosion, that's just the way it was.
Yeah. Jay here is asking for a little more on the connection about the Russian Navy and their ability or their instructions not to leave the Black Sea because of the Battle of Plevna. Can you go into that a little bit more?
One of the Tsar's goals in the Russo-Turkish War was to take Constantinople, and then in the treaty, his initial treaty, it provided for free navigation of the straits by at least merchant vessels. Most people, England in particular, because remember, England had fortified all of Africa to get its ships to India. The Suez Canal opened, those were all useless. All you cared about now was Egypt. And they were terrified Russia was going to be able to send warships to and from the Eastern Mediterranean. In the Congress of Berlin, that provision was removed. And there was neutrality of commerce, but not for warships. And then the Treaty of Montreuil in the 1920s, which was a continuation, this by then Russia was in Bolshevik hands, specifically provided that Turkey would not allow warships to pass in times of war. That is why the Black Sea Fleet cannot leave the Black Sea now. But it goes back to the British policy of enforcing closure of the straits to warships.
That's interesting. Walter here asks, and quite appropriate in the week of the eclipse here, thoughts on Mark Twain's model for Hank Morgan in Connecticut Yankee, perhaps General William Butler Franklin.
Well, Franklin wouldn't have been Hank Morgan, but Franklin did run the armory and kept it out of bankruptcy. Franklin was a really impressive man, first in his class at West Point. And Hank Morgan, I think, identified himself as a foreman before he got clocked over the head by an angry workman with a wrench and then woke up in Arthurian England. Twain would have known Franklin. Hartford wasn't that big, and Colt was very, very prominent, and Franklin himself was very prominent. General Franklin wouldn't be known to most people, but he, in fact, completed the dome of the Capitol building and did a lot of other important things before he went to Colt and really saved Colt from bankruptcy. But I don't think he would have been Morgan, except maybe as a personality, because Morgan as a character was more of a manager on the factory floor? It's
Excellent.
a very good question.
It is. And to that end,
And Franklin, by the way, was a Quaker. Just to round it out, what he was doing in the arms business, somebody else better figure out.
Yeah. To that end, I wanted to, and I'll drop in the chat for everyone to read. One of the bits of Mark Twain that I can do from memory. His first visit to Hartford in 1868, when he visits the Colt factory, and his description of seeing that factory, I think it's very early Twain. It's one of the best things you can read. So if you scroll down in this, but he describes it as a tangled forest of rods, bars, pulleys, wheels, and all the imaginable and unimaginable forms of mechanisms. It's a really fascinating thing that ends with, and then they pulled out a Gatling gun and let us shoot it till it ran out of ammunition.
Yeah.
In his description, notably his description of Hartford as having the broadest, straightest streets that ever led a sinner to destruction, this incredibly moral town that is also producing, massive amounts of weaponry. But it's a really great, description to read.
Well, Hartford was, I mean, what we now call, I think, Capitol Avenue used to be called Rifle Avenue because Sharps was one end and Colt was at the other. And the Gatling gun was this ferocious thing we've all seen or heard about. I have in the book a copy of the lithograph of the Colt factory, and Twain's description is right on. It's all belts and pulleys and rods and machines, one after the other, churning out all these small parts. And it was a real miracle in terms of the advance of industrial planning. I could see why he was so impressed by it. But it led to so much else. Hartford became the center of manufacturing of a lot of other things too. But Colt was the first big factory to be there.
Yeah, and that you'll see, I think the Sharps factory, then you get like weed sewing machines and bicycle, all of these things kind of in the same building complex.
Well, I think, all these came out of the gun business: bicycles, sewing machines, typewriters, even wristwatches were spawned by the gun business. And they all have this thing in common, which is they have a lot of very finely made, precise parts. And the techniques for making them came out of what came to be called armory practice, but it was guns. And it was an entrepreneurial time, and a lot of people started with, say, Colt and moved on. I mentioned Pratt and Whitney. They started as mechanics at Colt and went into the machinery business, but that's only the beginning. It was a real hotbed of innovation, and that put Hartford on the map. And then it went downriver, and you had other places like Bridgeport that also became real high-tech places.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that you have the lithograph, because that's what Twain starts that paragraph with. But he's so fascinated to see the place where he's seen the effects of these guns in the West. But he's also amazed because Hartford, the reason he ends up there is it's a huge publishing center. And he's amazed to see both the insurance companies and the lithographers who've made the insurance calendars he has seen all over the country, as well as the factories. Yep. Hartford, you can see why he got so into his own tinkering and innovations. If only he had stayed with successful things like the scrapbook and not the page compositor, which, if anyone here has not been to the museum, if you want to see something with a million moving parts that never moved quite right, the page compositor in our museum center is one. Working with a student recently, I asked her, what looks like it might break on this? And she said, everything, which I think is an appropriate way of thinking about these kinds of machines. So thank you both very much. I can't wait to get a copy of this for my department so we can start digging in. Our living history coordinator, who is always working away on her sewing machine next door, I'm going to make sure she reads the relevant parts here. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Dean, for taking us through this book.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. Our next in-person and online event is actually about the history of Gillette Castle. So if you're interested in that, I'm dropping the link in there right now. Join us for The Trouble Begins with Paul Schiller in a few weeks. Otherwise, thanks very much for joining us tonight. This will, in a certain amount of time when we get to it, end up on our YouTube channel. So if you like this and you want to share it with anyone, you'll be able to do that soon. So thanks, everyone, and have a good night.
Dean.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.